If you drive to work in the morning like I do, sitting in traffic on the Mass Pike or 93 or 95 heading toward Boston can feel like the worst commute on the planet. And it turns out the worst isn't very far off. According to the transportation analytics company INRIX, Boston is the 14th most congested city in the world and the 7th most in the U.S., with drivers spending about 60 hours in traffic a year on average. For the record, I personally hit that every couple of months. But when it comes to a solution, there is only gridlock on Beacon Hill. Governor Charlie Baker is clashing with local lawmakers over a pilot program that aims to reduce rush hour traffic by lowering toll prices at least 25% during off-peak non-rush hours. Lawmakers passed the measure last month with the belief that lower prices would encourage workers with flexible schedules to shift their commutes. But Governor Baker argues that such a small discount wouldn't make much of a dent in traffic.
We should do a congestion study about a lot more than just tolling on 2 or 3 roads. There are many routes in and out of Boston that don't have tolls on them.
So he ultimately vetoed the idea. But is there any hope left for this proposal to come to pass? And if so, is it really the best way to reduce congestion in and around Boston? Joining me are Chris Dempsey, Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, a coalition of organizations aiming to improve transit across the state, and Charlie Cipio, Senior Fellow at the Pioneer Institute and former Policy Director for Governor Romney. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Adam.
So, Chris, give me some more details on what this pilot would have done if it had become law. What hours would the discounted tolls have been in place? How discounted would they have been?
So, Adam, let's just start with the basic premise that traffic in Massachusetts is in a crisis. The average driver spends $2,000 every year just sitting in traffic. If you're a household of 2 drivers, you're wasting $330 every month from wasted fuel, wasted wages, and the higher cost of goods throughout society. Now, a technique that regions around the country have embraced is something called smarter tolling. And basically, it's giving drivers an incentive to shift their trips if and when they have that flexibility. Think of it kind of like an early bird special or matinee pricing at a movie theater. And the beauty of this is that traffic is a nonlinear function. That's a really geeky term. But what it means is that if you can get a small number of cars off the road, you can actually get a large impact in traffic. It's about 5% of cars off the road gives you a 20% reduction.
Okay.
And so the goal of this pilot was to provide discounts to drivers in the off-peak periods to convince them to shift their trip and see if that actually freed up road space for those that need it.
So when would those off-peak periods have started? Would it have been 8:30, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning?
According to this legislation, that was up to MassDOT.
Okay.
The only requirement was that the discount be at least 25%.
So the parameters were fairly expansive.
Very
right?
flexible
Those
for the governor. Correct.
Okay, and what was the governor's rationale when he nixed this?
Well, I think his focus is on the MBTA, and we appreciate the focus he has brought to the T in bringing reforms there. What we're asking him is to take that same reform mindset and apply it to our roads. Our roads are not working well today. You can think of it as almost a failed government service. And if he could tinker with it, roll up his sleeves and dig in on that question, we think he could really improve it for drivers.
Charlie, my recollection is that Governor Baker said, I think what we should be doing when it comes to bettering transit is focusing on things like the Green Line extension and regional transit authorities and making the T run more effectively and efficiently and punctually. When I saw those comments, I found them a little unconvincing because the T just can't get me efficiently from my home to here on a daily basis, even under the best circumstances. What did you make of the governor's arguments?
Well, I would agree with you. I didn't find that argument to be particularly compelling. And I think the fact of the matter is that the transportation system is interdependent. You know, the T is affected by how things are in the roads, and all of these things matter. And if we're gonna have a customer focused system that's going to make everybody's travel better, more convenient, we're going to have to look at all these things at once. And this, I think, was a very small step, a very low impact step to just make sure the technology works, and B, see what kind of impact the discount has on people's behavior.
Just as an aside, is there any doubt that the technology would have worked? I mean, wouldn't it simply have required that transponders process the lower toll if you're driving at a lower toll time?
So it's commonly used around the country, so the technology is proven. But I think there's an important point around MassDOT's organizational capacity to actually do this. It's one thing to have it in theory. It's another thing to actually have tried it out.
Might the governor have made a different decision if this had not been an election year?
Well, I don't know. You know, all the polls, okay, keep the polls and the tolls straight. All the polls, find it people support it by more than a 2-to-1 margin.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of those numbers. I believe this was a Mass Inc. WBUR poll. 60% of people in favor of lowering tolls at off-peak hours, which I guess isn't necessarily surprising if you're talking about lowering tolls. That sounds good. A much smaller amount backing raising tolls at peak hours, which I know this would not have done. Only 38% in favor of that. So I have the flexibility, fortunately, I probably shouldn't say this on air and draw my boss's attention to it, but I try to come in a little late anytime I can because it makes the commute markedly better. Some days it's not as improved as I'd like it to be, but on some days it's really quite good.
I thought you took the helicopter and just landed on the roof.
Right. Wouldn't this pilot have unintentionally penalize people who don't have the luxury that I do, especially people who maybe work in lower income service jobs where they can't drift in at a semi-respectable hour because they'll lose their jobs if they do it? Isn't that a big issue?
Adam, that's a great question. Actually, somewhat counterintuitively, we think it's the people that have the least flexibility that actually benefit the most from this program.
Why?
If it's really important that your road works because you need to get to the office by 9 o'clock or you need to get to the babysitter or the daycare by 6 o'clock to pick up your kid, you want a road that works reliably for you and gives you a fast trip. And if this technology can help do that, then you're the biggest beneficiary. And just one more piece. Sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was going to say, and if it succeeds in getting more people off the road at that time, it makes your commute that much easier.
That makes sense to me, but the awkward fact would still remain, right, that you might have someone who is rushing in to start preparing lunches for the lunch rush, paying more when it comes to tolling than a hedge fund manager who's able to cruise in at 10.
What I would say is that a lot of those wealthy white-collar workers are already shifting around the traffic, and they're already able to deal with a system that's not working very well. It's the blue-collar worker that has the least flexibility, and that's the trip we're trying to help the most. I'll give you one more example, Adam. The 111 bus is the MBTA's third busiest bus line in the entire system. It picks up most of its riders in Chelsea and drops them off in Haymarket, where they work in downtown Boston or on the Orange Line. It can take that bus 45 minutes to go 2.7 miles. That's an average speed of less than 4 miles an hour. And that is stuck on the Tobin Bridge. If we had smarter tolling on the Tobin Bridge, we would speed that trip up, and those blue-collar workers that live in Chelsea and work in downtown Boston would have more time with their families or more time at their job.
I have been stuck in that very bus on the Tobin Bridge, so I know what you're talking about. Isn't it inevitable that if we moved ahead with this, looking at lower tolls in off-peak hours, and if that worked as well as you're saying it probably would, wouldn't we inevitably then start having a conversation about raising tolls in peak hours to consolidate and increase whatever improvements we'd seen through discounts?
I think it just means that we're going to have an informed debate about how to move forward with transportation policy and how to fund it. If we're going to have an informed debate, if we're going to have a good debate about that, we need to know how it's going to affect people's behavior. We need to know that the technology is going to work. This provides that information.
You've talked about other cities taking this approach. How many of them have gone with the discounted route, and how many of them have actually just upped tolls at peak hours?
It's a mix of the two. So New York City has discounts for off-peak, and then even overnight you pay an even lower rate than that, which makes a lot of sense. Adam, I think people are frustrated by tolling, and that frustration is totally justified. They're paying into the system, and they feel like they're not getting anything out of it. They're paying on the Pike, but they're not paying on 93. And people on the Pike say, why am I paying and my cousin that lives on the North Shore or South Shore isn't? I want to be very clear. That frustration is totally justified. What this could do is actually improve people's commutes. And then you would still be paying a toll, but you'd be getting a much better service for it. And that would be a benefit.
From your vantage point, is it too early to contemplate the possibility of raising tolls at peak hours?
I think it's way too early. What we're saying is not that we want to raise tolls, not that we want to lower tolls. We want a road that works for people. We want it to work for drivers, bus riders, truckers, everyone that depends on it.
Tell me if I'm wrong here. It's my understanding that the reason the governor was able to veto this without worrying about having the veto overridden is because the legislature moved kind of slowly to wrap up the budget this year. Am I correct about that?
That's
okay.
True.
So given that they couldn't take another crack at this, is this idea now dead in the water until the next mad dash to the finish when the legislature tries to wrap up a budget? Or is this something that has generated enough interest on Beacon Hill that you might see them act on it sooner rather than later in the next session?
My sense is that we're going to hear from this. This issue is going to come to the fore once again very early in the next session. And maybe
look, there were leaders, especially in the Senate, but also in the House, that took a stand on this. Bipartisan leaders like Senator Tarr, who's a Republican, Senator Boncory, who's a Democrat and the chair of the Transportation Committee. We are grateful for their support for this, and they know how bad the traffic is out there. They're looking for solutions. We applaud them for raising it this session, and we think it'll come right back next session.
All right. Chris Dempsey, Charlie Tripio, thank you both for being
here. Thank you, Adam.